There's some classic ones. If you want to get into one with Joe McMoneagle, remote viewing with the submarines. But the point was that, information was coming in and rejected just because we can't do it, therefore it can't happen and it must be false or whatnot. So this was one of the reasons we were using the metal bending techniques, the BK sorts of things that we did with what were called lub-ins, where group commanders from around the world would come in. And the point to them was not, oh, you bent metal, that's interesting. It was, you didn't think that could happen. You've now seen it happen. The point is, when you start getting information that you don't understand, don't just reject it because you, A, don't understand it or don't believe it could exist. And, that's come up in science time and time again, where the experts reject something because they don't understand or don't think it can happen. And as I said, there were several instances where we were blindsided by Soviet advances, and you went back and looked, said, sure enough, the information was there. We just, the analysts chose to ignore it.
And welcome to yet another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It's Luciano here as your host. And before we get into it here with John Alexander, I insist on mentioning that we are a non-for-profit and a charity. So most of our regular listeners know that already. If you feel so inclined to go to the website and donate to our cause, which is an ongoing mission to find out really the truth through what ifs and why nots, through the conversations with people we've been having all over the world. Anyway, I digress. You can just go to our website. It's behindgreatness.org. Thank you for your listenership. Please share with everybody you know and everybody you care to know, and rate us if you have a few moments. So here we go. As promised, we have Dr. John B. Alexander here on the podcast. He has been a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons since he created renewed interest in the field starting in 1989. He was a colonel of the U.S. Army, the colonel of infantry until 1988 when he retired. Through 66 to 69, he actually commanded a Special Forces A team in Vietnam and Thailand. After retiring from the Army, Dr. Alexander joined Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he was instrumental in developing the concept of non-lethal defense. As a program manager, he conducted non-lethal warfare briefings at the highest level of government, including the White House staff, National Security Council, members of Congress, Director of Central Intelligence, and senior defense officials. He's been a distinguished lecturer at several DoD universities, has advised the CIA, U.S. Special Operations Command, and National Intelligence Council. He's published many articles, including the Harvard International Review, the Boston Globe, the Futurist, the Washington Post, several others. He's been on TV, including Dateline, Fox News, Larry King, CNN, MSNBC, across the globe: Australia, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Brazil, Switzerland, Netherlands, UK, and Japan. You can check out his... was this your latest book, The Reality Denied? That was your latest one, right?
It's the most recent one, yeah.
The most recent one from a few years back, Reality Denied, Firsthand Experiences with Things That Can't Happen, But Did. Welcome to the show, John.
Glad to be here.
We've had a couple of really cool chats, and I call them cool because every time I learn, I get excited. And when I start putting pieces together with people who have lived through the experiences to tell me firsthand, I get even more excited. You happen to be friends with and have worked with, and I didn't know this, naively didn't know this, with several of the people who have been on our podcast already.
Right. Well, I've been in the field for a few decades, so yeah. Yeah. And had recognized a number of the names when looking at the file. So.
Well, so speaking of being in the field, let's quickly go to one thing that you sent me early on. So you were born in Manhattan, grew up in Wisconsin. You joined the Army at 18. This is what you said. You like jumping out of airplanes more than school, and then you took off 19 times before you even landed in an airplane in 1950s.
Correct. Yeah.
what brought you to join the Army to begin with? Because then later you had you went back to school and you got a master's and then PhD as well. But in the meantime, why is it that you joined the Army?
Well, at the time, Special Forces was just coming, just actually been created. And I had read stories about that. And as I said, I'm looking for adventure. So I had to get school. I had a scholarship to college, which frankly didn't excite me very much. And I said, I think I'll go try this out. And I had friends that had joined, but so I signed up to go jump out of airplanes, literally.
I mean, you didn't follow suit anybody in the family. You were the first to enter the military, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Straight into the air.
Yeah.
What is it, or what was it about jumping out of the air or jumping out of a plane and being tens of thousands of feet up? What was it about that?
Well, I'm not sure. It just sounded exciting at the time, so I think we'll go try that.
So it sounded exciting. What was exciting about it when you were living through it?
Well, airborne was a little bit different than it is today. Parachutes were not quite the same as they are today. And my first assignment was 101st Airborne that had just been reactivated at that time. At the end of World War II, the division had been deactivated and now was coming back in. So that was my first assignment. Ended up as a medic, enlisted for a long period of time, and eventually, well, I was a sergeant first class years later and then went to officer candidate school. By that time, I was already in Special Forces, or what folks will know as Green Berets.
Mm-hmm. You did that for 3 years.
No. That's the combat time. No, I was SF. I think we were 60, 61, somewhere around there. I spent a decade with Special Forces assignments.
Yeah. Speaking of combat time, there were a few close calls there that I read about and heard about as well. In your experience, seemed pretty harrowing. Almost getting your legs blown off by millimeters.
That happens in war. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fast forward here, because in your bio, I read to the listener that you headed up. Now I want to use the right word. The development. There you go. Development of non-lethal weapons. What is non-lethal weapon? What is that?
Well, weapons that don't kill people, obviously. Now, by this time, I had retired and had joined Los Alamos National Laboratory, which was second career. Mm-hmm. Was looking at the various actions that were taking place. Just Fury had happened. That was the invasion of Panama. Or Just Cause. Urgent Fury is similar in Grenada, where we had interactions, and the military had been geared up for overwhelming firepower. And so I was looking at that and said, one of the problems, particularly in Panama, we wanted them to be friendly at the end. You had big families with long memories.
Yeah.
And so, killing a lot of folks didn't make sense. Which, I've addressed this in The Changing Nature of War. Said the idea is not necessarily killing; it's imposition of will. Mm-hmm. And you're, I think, better off doing that if you, in a way, break the cycle of violence that we know about in the civilian sector. There's still, as we've reverted back to the old ways, and even if you listen to the discussions on Iraq and Afghanistan, saying you just can't kill your way out of these problems. So it's a matter of, from a national perspective, can we impart will and do it the most efficacious way?
So speaking of imposing will and using non-lethal, then you actually, let me preface that by saying that one of the first things you told me in our first chat, you just said it almost seemed like in a vacuum you said it, because we were talking about something, and I think you were about to digress to something, and you said to me, I've always been interested in weird shit.
Well, that does not have to do with non-lethal weapons. That has other areas I suspect we will get into.
Sure.
Now, earlier, just for the audience, when you said, what's a non-lethal weapon?
Mm-hmm.
The things you know about on the low end are, rubber bullets, if you will, rubber, but that's okay. Low kinetic energy sorts of things, pepper sprays, and taser or electrical converting. On the high end, however, we talk about strategic incapacitation. We're talking about taking down complex set like a nation state, and doing so where they can no longer fight, if you will. But you must be able to do it where you don't have secondary or tertiary casualties, i.e. taking down a power grid, but to do it in a way that you can bring it back up again when, after the cessation of hostilities. Yeah.
As a cessation of hostilities.
And it's everything in between. So from individual to nation state, those complex target sets.
Okay, fair. Thank you for the clarification there. So let's keep that apart then. The non-lethal. I naively assumed that it enveloped some of the weird shit, to use your words, that you were involved with, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, no, that's quite different. That goes back when we were on active duty, and the programs that most people know about, things like remote viewing program, i.e. psychic spying, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I had done work with psychokinesis and whatnot, and then independently later set up a project to look at the whole UFO phenomena.
In 1979, 1980, you wrote something. So you at this point you were working at the Pentagon.
No, I was actually in Command and General Staff College. You're going to talk about the new mental battlefield, I assume.
Yes.
And it was a year-long school for majors, lieutenant colonels, and frankly, not all that challenging. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote an article. I had no idea that it would actually get published. Serendipitously, what happened was this was in Military Review, which is a straight military journal. And serendipitously, the editor had a near-death experience. So when he read it, I frankly thought it was just get tossed aside as too strange to publish in that venue, if you will. But because of that, he had an out-of-body experience. And so the article came from, we'll publish it, to the cover cover story for the December issue.
And at this point, you were doing your PhD, or you just finished your PhD? Is that right?
I had just finished. I might mention that's another subset and a side issue, because if you know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the head of my doctoral committee. Mm-hmm. She's well known in medical circles. She's the one who wrote On Death and Dying, the 5 stages of grief, and that was her. And Raymond Moody had really just begun discussing what's now known as near-death experiences. And so these things sort of overlap in a kind of strange way. But I had met her years before and had just, I guess the doctorate was awarded just about the same time that I was at Command and General Staff College, which was a military school. The other was in the civilian sector.
And part of your PhD research, again, correct me if I'm wrong, you also studied NDEs under her mentorship, Elizabeth's mentorship. Is that right?
Well, I did, but that wasn't specific. The actual dissertation, she was running a workshop called Life, Death, and Transition, which was very unusual in that about a quarter, about a quarter of the people were interested, about half were medical professionals. The whole concept of hospice itself was just really beginning to get national attention.
Mm-hmm.
And NIH had been National Institute for Health or National Hospice Organization had been formed and whatnot. But in the West, in Europe, this had been common for some period of time. So she was really introducing it here in the West. And associated with that, had heard about the near-death experiences, which is what had attracted me to this particular program. But what we looked at were the changes in spirituality in individuals who had attended the workshop. Again, about half of the people were medical professionals, doctors, nurses, etc. About a quarter were like me, just kind of interested individuals. But the other quarter were dying. These were literally dying patients. So this was a very, very emotionally intensive kind of study. So what I ended up doing was measuring the changes that had taken place in people. We did pre-post, and it was called post-post testing.
Mm-hmm.
And normally when people go to these kind of social events, you get what's called a euphoric artifact. In other words, you come out of these group settings and people generally feel good. Mm-hmm. But then the expectation is kind of like dreams that will dissipate relatively quickly. And what we found, much to our surprise, was that not only did it not dissipate, many of these people had a stronger. Now, I'll throw in, so we're talking here, it was Elizabeth made me change one word, and that was from religious to spiritual. And that turned out to make all of the difference. And a number of people who said, I don't like the dogma of the church, but I consider myself a spiritual being, or have a spiritual relationship with some entity, God, whatever you want to call that. And a number of them said they were dogma. Others said, I kind of like the rituals of the church, but I'm still more on a spiritual bent as opposed to religious, that were imposing dogma, which is what many people tended to reject.
So this was kind of the background with what was going on, well, in your head and in your actual research when you wrote that article for the Military Review. So this Washington Post reporter, is it Washington Post? Yeah. He published an article in
the Voodoo Warriors of the Pentagon.
Yeah. And you caught some flack for that at the beginning.
Yeah. What was interesting, that was Jack Anderson, who was syndicated, but heavily with the Washington Post. And they got the story wrong, but they had heard about rumors about the remote viewing program, which was then in the classified domain. And they frankly thought, erroneously, that the public would be upset that, here's the nasty DOD, Pentagon's wasting your money, and said, here's this $20 million program, mm-hmm. How awful. I talked to the actual author, Jack Anderson, who had a guy under him who actually wrote the article. And they wrote it positively and slipped a few words to make it come out negative because they thought the public would be incensed. Instead, they said they got more letters to that article than anything he ever published, and he did a lot of, high-level dramatic stuff. And 90% ran against them. It was most of the people were saying, because there was a book that had come out about that time, the Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, And so there was kind of an awareness that this was the bad old days. The Soviets were exploring these areas, and most of the people were saying, yeah, this is a good thing. We're glad that the government is looking at, and predominantly that was in the remote viewing sector.
So yeah, speaking of the Iron Curtain and speaking of psychokinesis, because you mentioned that a few minutes ago, I want to go to Uri Geller, but not just yet, because there's a story.
Okay.
So you caught some flack when this came out, but then you want to share a story about the wife of a colonel?
Oh, well, what had happened when that story came out, I was an inspector general for the Department of Army in the Pentagon. And some colonel comes roaring in and said, "Did I write this article?" And said, "Yeah, I wrote it." I said, "Well, don't you know the procedures for getting it cleared?" And said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, how did this come out?" I said, "Well, what office are you from?" And I just happened to have had the clearance paper. I said, "Here, this is your office. you signed off." Roaring off. So
sure, you were then invited to change teams or to move to another team.
Well, one of the things that happened a short time after that is I was invited to meet with the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And I remember I'm a lieutenant colonel, and lieutenant colonels do not go and meet DepSecDef independently. It's just, we always have general officers that go along to nod their head and say this one. So anyway, they had sent to see me, and this had come through some other external impossible connections. So at 12:30 this particular day, I went up to the E-ring on the fifth floor, the top floor of the Pentagon, and we had a very pleasant conversation. And one of the things was, "Well, who do you work for?" And I explained all that. So I left. I said, "Well, I was interesting." And about 4:20 that afternoon, I had the IG, the chief of staff for the inspector general, came in and said, "Tomorrow morning you don't work here anymore." The guy had moved me that fast, so that was a very high level that was supportive. These, frankly, just most people think there are people who are supportive, and there's some others who are very, very negative in these areas. Mm-hmm. One of the things I say in my briefing, I say when it says the Pentagon says. So the Pentagon doesn't say anything. It's a big stone building, and is filled with about 29,000 people, and they come with about 30,000 opinions. Yeah. So, yeah, like you find in the civilian sector, you find those who are supportive, mainly because they've had personal experiences, and others who. And one of the things we did run into is, and this is still occurring, you shouldn't do that. This is the work of the devil. So to this day, you get these religious objections.
Those objections are louder than the I guess the positive support that you get internally from folks who look at your work with curiosity.
That's very personality dependent. Who's in what place at what time. And so, as you know, the stuff we did with INSCOM was very supportive, but it ended up with my boss, who was, protecting me, the General Subelbein, being forced into retirement. Wow. He was there. That was part. Then from there, I was moved to. In fact, the entire time from the time I made major, I don't think the personnel system ever moved me again. I was always passed from one general to another who was supportive. And there were those who did not appreciate me at all.
Yeah, of course. Just like people nowadays who probably don't appreciate what you've been exploring, right?
I bear the 666. I warn people, if you go on the internet, be careful of, what you read there.
Always. And just you mentioned INSCOM a moment ago. That's Intelligence and Security Command, Arlington Hall in Virginia. Okay.
Right.
Um,
it's now at Fort Belvoir. It has moved. At that time, it was at Arlington Hall,
Virginia. Okay. You told me again, as we were going through some of the experiences that you were reviewing of others, and in your own experiences, you said the idea of separateness is an illusion. Explain.
Wow. Yeah, that's one of those kind of overarching questions. And I guess I would drop back to Max Planck, a German physicist, who says that consciousness is fundamental and that there is nothing. And this is kind of a basic theory that the physical arises from consciousness, as opposed to the other way, that consciousness is somehow something is being generated by the brain. We also suggest the brain and the mind are separate. So when you get into the concept of non-locality, which was something Larry Dossey and many others have talked about, he coined the term, but that consciousness is universal. And that the illusion is that we are separate from others. And you get back to your golden rule, if you will, do unto others because, and the whole notions of karma and those sorts of things are inherent in it. But my belief system is that consciousness is fundamental. It transcends everything. And so the idea that that you are separate from, and again, there's whole philosophical schools of thought, and quote religions based on this, that to return to the source or whatever.
So I'd like to branch off in a few ways. Before we do that, I want to mention, and this is not a plug for your book, but it is a plug for the title that you chose for your book, because it tells a lot. Because the material in your book, you go through a lot of the experiences that you've seen, experiences that you've researched and also seen. And you come at it with a critical eye. That's obvious in the reading, but you said firsthand experiences with things that can't happen, but did. Right. And in this program, we try to uncover how belief systems kind of inform us, but how maybe we need to overcome some belief systems. So when you use the word that can't, or the words that can't happen, you are referring there cheekily to belief systems that might be shaken.
Well, we're talking primarily about the materialistic world. I also stress that there are significant differences globally in fundamental belief systems. Mm-hmm. And as you know, we've talked to shamans all over the world. And in the West, we tend to talk about the real world and the spirit world as if those are separate and distinct. Many times when you talk to shamans, this is more like a continuum moving back and forth, and sometimes you have a hard time distinguishing what's, is separate. The materialistic world assumes that things arise from the material, and from a physics perspective, if we can just chop things into smaller and smaller parts, we'll come to the God particle, i.e. Higgs boson. Or when they did that, then you found out there's pentaquarks and whatnot. But that assumes that everything is, sequential, built on little tiny building blocks, and like Tinker Toys, you can build them bigger and better. That's not the system that I come from. And I point to issues in when you start with disparate temporal relationships, i.e. looking at time, because we think of time as kind of an arrow that starts usually from the left and moves to the right. You have the past, the present, and the future. By the way, not all cultures believe that, but when we got into in remote viewing things like precognitive and retrocognitive sorts of things, i.e., looking at events in the future or events in the past. And one of the things that comes up there, and very predominantly in the near-death literature, people have been close to death and recovered, is that our whole concept of time is wrong. The time itself is kind of an illusion, and some of the things coming up in quantum mechanics now look at if the past, present, and future are all simultaneously. That gets kind of tough to wrap one's head around.
Yeah, there's a movie that just won an award, Everything Now. I forget the title. I actually watched it on Netflix. Did you watch that movie, by the way?
I'm not going to plug them. I thought it was terrible, but
you know what?
Acting aside, everything all at once.
I agree.
We did watch it and just had trouble trying to make out where they were going.
Yes, I expected something more and a little bit more profound, but it wasn't. The acting was terrific, but
well, you got to separate the acting from the story. How it won that, frankly, Avatar 2, I thought was just in a class of its own.
It was a nice, fantastical movie too. I mean,
the Way of Water.
You said, so this is another interview you gave to Jeffrey Mishlove, who we've also invited to the podcast. And you were talking about the word paranormal, and we've talked about this as well on the podcast with past guests. To quote, you said, "I don't like the word paranormal just because it's rare. It's not different from."
Yeah. Well, I argue that there shouldn't be para anything, but maybe a parachute. But paramedics are medics. Paralegals operate in the legal domain. Paranormal, no, it's just normal. It just doesn't happen that frequently.
You also said, so let's continue on with this thread. You said, don't disregard things because you don't understand them. So I mean, this is obvious by what we've heard from you so far. And you said, we in the Army, we saw things repeatedly. You remember saying this?
I'm not sure which contact was. I think you're talking about the intelligence sector. This was one of the problems that, again, we're going back to the bad old days. This is really very straight world stuff. But the point was that certain events happen. Sputnik is usually put out as one of the biggest, where we were totally blindsided. And here the Soviets all of a sudden have, what's now very common thing, orbit. There's some classic ones. If you want to get into one with Joe McMoneagle, remote viewing with the submarines. But the point was that, information was coming in and rejected just because we can't do it, therefore it can't happen and it must be false or whatnot. So this was one of the reasons we were using the metal bending techniques, BK sorts of things that we did with what we called love-ins, where group commanders from around the world would come in. And the point to them was not, oh, you bent metal, that's interesting. It was, you didn't think that could happen. You've now seen it happen. The point is, when you start getting information that you don't understand, don't just reject it because you, don't understand it or don't believe it could exist. And, that's come up in science time and time again, where the experts reject something because they don't understand or don't think it can happen. And as I said, there were several instances where we were blindsided by Soviet advances, and you went back and looked, said, sure enough, the information was there. We just, the analysts chose to ignore it.
Yeah. So you mentioned two things there I want to highlight, especially. So you said Joe McGonigal and submarines. In the episode with Russell Targ, he explained how he trained Joe McGonigal. He became one of the best or most naturally talented remote viewer apparently on the planet.
001. Yep.
Yeah, and
Great guy.
he saw. Yeah, yes, that's what Russell tells me. Yeah, and every time I read about him, it's that that he's a good human being. That he found a submarine.
By the way, he's had a number of near-death experiences as well. But,
oh, I didn't know that.
He's always been kind of a psychic, but he's had a series of, impossible experiences that have happened to him.
Well, okay, all right. So I want to talk about psychism, but Joe's the one who found a Russian submarine being built in secret, behind closed doors, so to speak, and he found that using remote viewing. That's what you were referring to a few years ago.
CIA had some photographs of a big building, and they couldn't figure out what was going on inside. And so they tasked Joe to look inside the building. In that case, they gave him the geographic coordinates and whatnot. And he came back and said, they're building a number of submarines, but the one in particular was double hulled. And they also had the tubes were forward of the sail. Sail is the big thing that you see.
Yep.
The tubes are forward there, and there were a whole bunch of other technical things. They gave the information to our boat builders. Submarines are boats, not ships. And they said, "Oh no! If you built something that big, it would, when it went to depth, it would crush." And sure enough, and he even told them about when they were going to see it. And then the clouds parted, the cameras came on. There's a big ass submarine, which is now known as the Typhoon class submarine. And all of the things that he had predicted about it that were different from the way our boat builders designed things, that turned out to be accurate.
We're going to have Stefan Schwartz here as well on the podcast to talk more about remote viewing and some of the people there involved in that.
Mobius groups. Stefan was doing that. He's a good friend too, by the way. But he was doing it in the civilian sector, kind of in parallel too, and did. I'm sure you'll talk about the submarine. He's also get into his triple blind studies in archaeology, finding sites. His point, finding sites you didn't know existed.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. That blew my mind when I learned that. So let's go back, because you keep throwing, you keep leaving breadcrumbs as you go. And I don't want to forget. So you used psychokinesis twice, bending spoons, and psychic. Let me, I'm going to drop us down a couple of levels here just for the sake of asking you this question. I've always been, I was always a skeptic, but an incurious skeptic. So not one who investigated on things. I just, fluffed things off because I didn't understand them, like as we were speaking a few minutes ago. But there are people in my life, as well as I'm sure in yours and everybody else here listening, who would say something like, well, if you're a psychic, why aren't you rich?
Oh, you want my answer to that?
Yeah.
This is an infamous one from Uri, because they would ask Uri Geller, if you're a psychic, why aren't you rich? And the answer is, I am. And he has made the money, by the way. This has to do with mineral exploration. Joe McMoneagle has done similar things in the civilian sector since he's retired. But Ray did quite a bit with Pemex and in Mexico. But the point was that, and there are some people who, have looked at, can you get the next code for the, buying the lottery and whatnot. A flip side of that, if you go back to Edgar Casey,
yes,
who's known as the sleeping prophet, who was giving his thing. And when he attempted to use the things for personal gain, capability collapsed. Mm-hmm. And the point there was, there were certain ethical issues that he felt were He was not supposed to use it for personal gain, but supposed to be very altruistic and supporting others, which is where the vast majority of his work had done.
For me, that's a no-brainer. Well, I believe I have that capability, just like everybody else might. That's what I believe. I don't know it, but if mine were highly tuned, I would want to help. I mean, it's just the way it is.
I would also say one of the things you talk about being a skeptic. I have absolutely no problem with skeptics. I'm skeptical on a lot of things myself, but there's a huge difference between skeptics and debunkers. The people who enter the field just to say, they start with it can't be, therefore it isn't, and normally what they do is they find some niche that doesn't quite fit. And those are true in every sense of the word. So I would like to just distinguish, because I think being skeptical of claim, that's what keeps fraud down, if you will. And people probably on the internet aren't skeptical enough, but if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Okay. Point taken. Well made. Let's go to bending spoons. So actually, I don't want to go to bending spoons, but you mentioned it, and I think it's a nice spice to perhaps the story. But I learned about Uri Geller through Russell Targ, and he was a psychic who was found. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was found by Edgar Mitchell, and we've talked about Edgar Mitchell on this podcast.
Edgar was instrumental in bringing him over. Andrea Poharich was a scientist who had worked with him and brought him. Belk of Belk's department store is the one who had provided the funding and brought him into the U.S.
from Israel.
Edgar, as you know, had from Israel, had this profound experience during his Apollo mission.
Yeah,
and had set up what became IONS, but was also working with Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ at SRI, and brought Uri over. Many of us have become friends with him over the decades.
So just to encapsulate the story for the listener who's unsure, because we're throwing a lot of names, Edgar Mitchell was an astronaut, had a mystical experience in space. We talk about it with Diana Pasalka in a previous episode, but he founded IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and we've had two scientists from IONS, Dean Radin and Helena Wabe, on the podcast as well, so our listener can listen to that.
Okay, they're great.
They are
all friends. It's a small circle.
That's what I learned. Yeah, it's a small circle. It's exciting. It's exciting to know this. So Uri Geller, he was invited to the White House to actually on serious matters, but he was constantly being asked about, this is what I'm understanding, constantly being asked about the bending spoon thing.
Well, wait, no. If you're talking about my story, this was the U.S. Capitol as opposed to the White House.
Okay,
this was in the legislative branch. Yeah, he was coming on again. You got a time frame. This is the bad old days. Soviet Union is still up. His reason, Senator Pell, who was a proponent in many of these areas at the time, has since transitioned, but had brought him in because Uri was interested in talking about the plight of Soviet Jews. Mm-hmm. And was concerned about bringing more from Russia or Soviet Union to Israel. And so anyway, this particular meeting was set up. I was invited. I suspected things might happen, and I was sitting kind of as close as, not quite as from me to the screen, but very close up there. Because what happened was he was talking about things in the Soviet Union at the time. And everybody said, bend something, bend something, bend something. And he said, well, I haven't got anything. So they went out. We were in a skip, this secured facility, which had a guard outside. So they went out and they got a spoon out of the guard's coffee cup. Now that's important in that it means there was no preparation for it. He had never seen that spoon before or anything else. And he brought the spoon out, and he's holding it by the bowl, goes like this, and the thing bends up. So he went on talking. He put it on the back of the chair, and it continued to bend. As a matter of fact, it's sitting in one of those things right behind me. Right. I still, you can't see it. I have a number of the more dramatic.
You told me you've kept them. Yeah.
Bent metal. But anyway, but the point was it continued to bend, and then it fell and somehow ended up in my pocket.
And now on your wall. It's great.
Yeah. But the point was, and I had this discussion with the amusing Randy, who's one of the famous debunkers, did not go like this. In other words, where he's got his fingers on both sides of the neck. And there are a number of ways you can physically manipulate those things. I've had magicians involved. We'll have lunch with one in a couple of days here who's kind of made it his shtick. So we know how to manipulate it and whatnot. And that is definitely not what happened. When I talked to Randy about it like this, he kept saying, that would be $1 million. Okay. The problem in most cases is you don't know when and where these things are going to happen. I've seen a number of these spectacular psychokinetic events, but predicting again when and where is just doesn't happen.
You can't predict the universe. You're in it. You mentioned a while ago here in this talk UFOs. What are your thoughts on, because you shared at least high level with me last time we chatted, on non-human intelligence?
We're talking about UFOs or non-human intelligence?
Yeah, that's right. There are two things. Well, let's stick with the UFOs.
Very different items. Well, the first line of my book on UFOs is UFOs are real. And I mean that is hard. It's sometimes hard physical crap. The last paragraph goes something like, and whatever this is, it is more complex than we can imagine. So the idea of complexity fits in there. Life, I point out, there have been reports of contacts between humans and sentient non-humans throughout the entirety of human history, literally going back millennia. Mm-hmm. And that they happen to fly in little tin cans is something that's relatively new. My other generic comment on UFOs is, what do you mean? I've got little balls of light that move around. Ones we were discussing earlier that, like within the past week, I've seen them. Mm-hmm. We've got hard craft that are miles across, and thousands of variations in between. So where do you draw the lines on these?
I got to know the story of Chris Bledsoe. And then when you and I met, you had given me a little bit more as well. He just came out a book you showed me right before the recording, UFO of God. Right. Give us your experience with Chris Bledsoe's story, North Carolina, for listeners who don't know.
Well, this one is so phenomenal, and I haven't spoken to him since yesterday. And he's the one, when I mentioned getting videos that have been taken within the last week, and these are orbs flying around. Initially, I heard this phenomenal story, and I had met him actually up in Pennsylvania, and my wife and I went down to North Carolina and spent several days with him there. And he was describing the story. So the initials, by the way, we haven't got the hours it would take to do justice to the story, but he had an initial incident in 2007. So we went back to the site and he was showing us where things had happened. He has missing time and all of that. So we came back up a small hill, a couple 100 meters. We're leaning, Chris and I are leaning against the fender of the car. My wife and Emily, his daughter, are inside the car. And he's describing, well, this is where this happened, and I saw this UFO over here. And all of a sudden he says, oh, I think they're here. And with that, this thing within the next few seconds just pops into view and goes zipping off. And they say it's a temporal relationship, huh?
When you say this thing, it was an orb, is that right?
A bright white light up in the sky.
Okay.
Can't say that it had structure, but the point was the temporal relationship. I mean, it was literally within probably 10 seconds of him noticing us here. Now, in his original story, and the thing that gets of interest, again, there's missing time and all that. He haven't got time for all of that, but he goes home. He gets scared, frankly. He goes back and he sees something peering in his window. And he lived on a 5-acre plot at the time. And he goes outside, and this creepy crawler is chasing him. And so he runs down. He finally gets caught, and he goes, "Okay, you got me." And he gets a telepathic message that says, "You don't understand. We're here to help." Fast forward next morning, getting around noon, and he says, "Gee, I haven't taken my medicine today." It turns out he had Crohn's disease rather seriously for a number of years. If you know Crohn's, it can be socially relatively debilitating. And to this day, has never had to take another pill. Most importantly about the case, though, is that it is ongoing. I did write, turns out there's 2 forwards for the book. I wrote one of them because many of the people who interact with him go home and start having events. And there was a classic one last October. We talked, and you said, I'm in Las Vegas. He's on the East Coast, so like you, a 3-hour time difference. So point is, it's afternoon where I am, evening where he is. And so we started discussing. He said, well, when you call and the UFOs, the orbs show up. And so while we're talking, he goes outside with his camera on the phone, and here are these things floating along, but you can hear us talking. So this was definitely not manipulated sometime later. You actually hear in the recording, he and I talking on the phone, and the camera capturing both the audio aspect of that and these orbs that are kind of floating around the trees at that location. And again, I had some more of those as recently as, the last few days.
Have you seen the orbs in person?
No, I've only seen the thing. I like what my brother says about this, is that I study these things that even family members tend to see. So they tend to happen around me more like a catalyst than. Although, I mean, there's been quite a few events, stuff in Brazil and in Africa and whatnot, that I've certainly seen lots of firsthand incidents like that.
Care to share one that has stuck out for you?
Oh, I think one of the big ones has to do, we were at voodoo ceremonies in West Africa. And this had to do with fire. We had people stand on the fire, sit in the fire, eat the fire. And again, I'm filming at very, very close range. It's hot. And just people define the laws of thermodynamics. One of the classics is the witch doctor, a shaman, who's there, and he's got this stick with the flame. You see the guy's flame just face disappear in the flame and whatnot. And the point is, when you look at the thing, he's got long shin whiskers and not singed at all.
Wow.
Now people came up and said, well, maybe they have some kind of special chemicals. You go, understand, this is a poverty level that looks up to dirt. And so that they would have some kind of these, phenomenal, unheard of asbestos-like materials that can protect them, and all this. Not true. Saw the same similar kinds of things in Mongolia as well.
I'm looking for the episode number. It's interesting that you said West Africa. I'm looking for it here on my phone. His name is Rune, and here he is, episode 90. The listener might want to listen to that. He studies. He is an expert in Nordic mysticism and Nordic culture, in indigenous culture, and he married a West African woman. And so, because his interest, before he started doing that, his interest was in voodooism in West Africa. So he educated a lot, excuse me, on the origins.
We were, the things we saw with, I would also emphasize, as I'm sure he did,
Yeah.
Voodoo is an entire way of life. It's not a little thing.
Yeah.
It's incorporated in everything. And you look at their healing system. One of the problems in Africa is that, healthcare is not what it is in the United States or the Western world. And numbers I saw is they had one healthcare worker for every 10,000 people. That doesn't mean a doctor, that means healthcare workers.
Yeah.
And so they rely on alternatives. And when you go around there, you see the flags up, which means the doctor is in. We're talking about the voodoo practitioners. Pretty intensive stuff. I would like to be in contact with him.
Well, with Rune?
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I'll make the intro. He'd be more than happy to speak to you. I mean, it's another discussion, I think. And we start to have this discussion with a couple of people as well in the program. It's about losing our indigeneity as well, right? So when we talk about shamans, we talk about healers, people who are in tune with the non-material and the biological, understanding that it is all just one. Right. I mean, I come from my people, my heritage is of southern Italy. These are people who lived in the mountains and who still do for the most part. But they came from a very mystic-like culture, still Western world, but of course supplanted by religion and science for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's all there underneath. It's all there. We just have to look. Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting about you, John, actually, is because you've been looking. You've been searching, you've been looking. And that's why it's interesting to talk to you, because you have all these stories, all these experiences of researching, not just experiencing yourself. So I have two last questions for you. Second last question. Where do you believe and how do you believe you exist after your body passes away?
Oh, say you got me easy ones, but no, I think continuation of consciousness beyond physical death is almost a certainty. And exactly what it is now, there's a question that arises there, and that's the continuation of consciousness versus continuation of personality. And one of the issues we're dealing now, particularly with mediums who are in contact with external entities, and some talk about kind of a spiritual integration with a greater whole sort of thing. However, when you're talking to mediums and they usually talk about individuals, and they give you, specific examples of what, their life was in corporate. So again, we're into the terribly complex. Recommend the work Gary Schwartz is doing here. One of my questions that I ask people now is, who were you? I happen to come from, I think reincarnation is the area that makes kind of the most sense in this, and that you bring certain attributes forward. Unfortunately, we think there's esoterically kind of the veil of forgetfulness when you were born. We think that in a pre-carnate state, you made certain decisions as to what you were going to do and go and do things. Unfortunately, and my personal position, will somebody just tell me what to do? Let's just tell me where to go and get on with it, as opposed to kind of bumbling along and experiencing all of these things, but having to figure it out.
Well, so maybe this is a lead up question. So this is like the 1B. Do you think you'll decide to reincarnate again, or do you think you would stop the cycle, the search for more?
I'm not sure that's a decision. I mean, to attain Atman, I think the cycle seems to be eternal. And frankly, if you've read any of my writings, I'm very concerned about this. Gets into the geopolitical aspects of what's going on. I think we've kind of screwed up the world. And one of my concerns is we're going to have to come back and fix it.
Last question then. What is greatness to you?
I have no idea. That's got to be kind of relative, obviously. How do you define it in what terms? Are we talking about physical terms? Are we, in carnal terms? Are we talking in spiritual terms? Yeah, I don't know how to begin to address something that complex.
Well, maybe we need to have you on a second time down the road to see if we can explore that. John, thank you. Thank you so much for this. Been wonderful speaking to you before this recording and now having the time together to do it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.